Hi, welcome to Northern Disclosure, our watch podcast about the famous and brilliant Northern exposure with Rob Morrow and Janine Turner. I am Janine Turner, so welcome to the show. We're thrilled to have you here. Our special guest today is we've been joking with him off camera, our king, our creator, our God, our father, Joshua Brand, who is the creator of our show and the genius behind the show, along with John Falsey, who is no longer with us, but Josh is, and we're thrilled to have him with us today. And Rob, I'm going to we can talk about a little bit about the second episode, Brains, Know-How, and Native Intelligence. I watched it this morning and I literally cried. And in a minute, I'll tell you why. But welcome to the show, Rob.
Thanks, Janine. You look beautiful. And I have to tell you, I watched that episode last night again to remind myself. And, it's funny what objectivity does in distance, because when I have memories of doing it, but I also have this distance, and I've just now watched a couple the first two episodes, and I am falling in love with Maggie. I'm falling in love with your performance. I'm seeing things that I didn't really I just wasn't clocking because I was, narcissistic or whatever. But it's really lovely to go back. And that episode, we were all so innocent. Right. I mean, it was eventually we became aware of our success, and that informed the show for good and bad ways. But at that moment, we were all kind of thrown into this adventure together, led by Josh and John and watching the show and all the different elements of it, the mysticism, the literary qualities, and as I was saying before, I'm amazed how it doesn't feel dated. It's amazing to me.
I think you've hit on all the points. When I watched the show this morning, I literally teared up and cried, because it's just what I can't wait to talk to Josh about is the poignancy of humanity, how it points out the fallibilities of humans. And I think that the main thrust of episode 2 was about pride. And about how pride keeps us from fulfilling our true destinies, and just the humanity, and how all the characters have an arc. And also in each episode, each character kind of had its debut. And I think that in this episode 2, it was Barry Corbin's who just rises to the challenge. He was so good. But Barry Corbin's episode, and Rob, you're always solid, just so solid. And Darren Burroughs was so vulnerable, and but just the humanity of the episode and the arc of watching someone having their spontaneous, fallible human reaction, and then coming to terms with it and resolving it at the end, and kind of making an amends, and how people resolved their issues, and how there was forgiveness and mercy. And I think that that's one of the things that moved me so much. What about you, Rob?
I remember Josh describing the show as, it was a benevolent universe, and it's so clear. And it's not like a saccharine, universe. It's not Pollyanna, but there's something that about all these characters, as you say, finding their humanity that is timeless, which I guess is part of the reason, aside from the fact that people are still wearing plaid and still driving pickup trucks, the themes of the show are universal and eternal. And that becomes clear. And I think, as you said, what I guess is happening as we're seeing the series roll out, and as we do each episode, is each episode introduces the world to the character, and this was Barry's, and Barry rose to it. You see why he was cast, and again I saw John Corbett. I forgot how great. I mean, I knew how great he was, but like even in he had, as we said in our first podcast, Corbett didn't have one line in the pilot. But then he comes on with this, beautiful Whitman, poetry and this philosophy that's so fascinating. So it's interesting watching each character get introduced.
It is, and you mentioned Walt Whitman. I'm a poet, so and you are too because you're a songwriter. We're both songwriters now later in life, and I'm a poet. And you wrote an endorsement for my book. Thank you very much. But the poetry of Walt Whitman and the fallibility of Walt Whitman, and how Maurice talks about he just wants a hero. Right? That a lot of times we don't need to know all that went on. We just need to have a hero. And then at the end, Barry Corbin, also Maurice, says, I would defend him. I would defend him. If he were standing here, I would fight for him. And he would fight for him no matter what his preferences were in any personal regard. He would fight for him because he cared for him as a human being. And that's when I started to cry. And Josh, we'll bring Josh on in a minute. But I mean, that arc of Barry's where he was like, I can't believe he's talking about this. But really, he was saying that because he didn't want Walt Whitman. He wanted Walt Whitman just to stand on his art alone and not to bring his personal life into it. But he said, I will stand up for him no matter what his personal life is. And I think that was the arc that was so moving. It's when I started to cry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's we can talk about the writers with Josh. Stuart Stevens wrote or is credited with writing the episode, and Peter O'Fallon, who I fell in love with when he showed up. He hadn't done, I don't know if he did any except commercials. He was a big commercial director, and he just had such a great, I don't know how you felt about him, but he had such a great vibe and as you know, I think Josh and John goal was to try to make the shows like little movies, independent movies, and Peter had a very cinema, disposition, and so the show looked beautiful. I mean, it was, and we haven't spoken about Jimmy Heyman, who we have to get as a guest at some point. Who the lighting, it was beautifully lit.
And the environment was so incredibly gorgeous. I mean, just when you went to talk to Chris in the morning, and out there with the water, and how you had to jump in the water, and I think that the environment of which was actually the Roslyn, Washington, out in the Cascade Mountains, which is where we really were to sub as Alaska, but Alaska was a star of the show for sure. Well, perhaps now is a good time to bring Joshua Brandon. What do you say, Rob? Shall we bring in our creator?
I'm excited. I'm excited to have him here. Yeah.
Okay, well, now we're going to bring in Joshua Brand, who is, I will always have a special place in my heart for Joshua Brand because he believed in me and he hired me for this role. And I have vivid memories of the audition process, but he will always be a special person in my life for believing in me to portray Maggie O'Connell. And Joshua Brand, we want to bring in Joshua Brand, our creator, along with John Falsey, who is no longer with us. But Joshua Brand, I want to bring you on. And as we bring you into the room, I just want to say, Joshua Brand, the show that you created, and I know all the fans want to hear all the behind the scenes, your sense of poetry and humanity and depth of artistic and cultural and just intellectual depth made the show what it was. And I was looking it up this morning, and Northern Exposure was nominated for 116 awards. And I found awards, by the way, that Rob, I didn't even know I was nominated for. I'm like, I didn't know I was nominated for that award. And 116 awards and 2 Peabody. Pulitzer, Peabody, I think they're Peabodys, right? I always
Peabody, yeah.
Peabody. 2 Peabody Awards. But Josh, you believed in Rob Morrow, you believed in me, and I will forever love you for that and for creating these amazing, wonderful characters. So everybody, welcome Joshua Brand, our father, our God. Yay! Welcome, Josh.
Thanks. Yeah. Grandfather, actually, not father anymore, but yeah. Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we are thrilled you're here. I'd love maybe to get the ball rolling. Can you talk a little bit about how this came about? First of all, how you became a TV writer, and then how and when you hooked up with John Falsey, and then how what the genesis of the show was.
Well, I'll try to give you a very abridged version because it would take up all your time and then we wouldn't even have time to say goodbye. But my background was in literature. I was an English major and then I went to graduate school in English literature. So I didn't go to film school and I wasn't a guy who knew all the great movies and stuff like that. And I didn't really know people who had done that, but my background was in books. I knew books and plays and poems. And so that's kind of where I came from. And I always believed that good readers make good writers. And I was a big reader. I read all kinds of things. I still do. And in terms of John and I, we both were story editors on a show called The White Shadow. We weren't a team. And we were the only two people who wrote. All the producers weren't writers. And so we basically had to do all the episodes. We had to do all the stories and farm out the scripts. And back in the day, there were no writers' rooms. I mean, the people.
What does that mean, story editor? Can you just tell us
well,
what that
is? Well, it was just a title. It's not a producer. It was,
Right.
I had to write 6 episodes of the show before they made me a story editor. Which today, if you write an episode or 2, you're a consulting producer.
Right.
So it was a very different time, but we learned how to work quickly because this was when on Northern Exposure as well. When we did full seasons, it was 22 episodes, and so after that. We both worked on St. Elsewhere, and after that, I left, and then John chose to leave, and then people wanted to hire us together, and we did a couple of other things, and then we had a deal at Universal, and somebody came to us at Universal and said that there was Universal had I forgot what the word was, but they had a deal with CBS and for a summer series. And at that point, they didn't do summer series. There were no summer series. Now, the season is 12 months a year, but then there was a fall season and that ran and then it stopped in the summer. And there also weren't shows on distant locations. Now, of course, I'm in New York. Janine's in Texas, Rob is in Los Angeles. You can live anywhere, and we all have Zooms. But back in the day, everything was coming out of Los Angeles for the most part, and so you had to be in Los Angeles. I know Janine, when we cast you, you were in New York, I believe, and so when you were put on tape, we never actually got to see you in person before casting you. And Rob, you were in Los Angeles, even though you might have lived in New York.
No, I met you in New York. I met you at
that's
Universal.
Well,
Yeah, I read for you and John.
No, there you go. So, essentially, what we were told was they wanted to do a medical show, and I had zero interest in doing a medical show because I had done St. Elsewhere, and I was just done with that. And I don't like repeating myself. I'm not one of those guys who, will just do a legal show or a cop show, and I generally haven't repeated myself, and intentionally, because I'm much more interested in the world than I am in myself. I like myself well enough, but I'm much more outwardly directed. I like people who are not like me. I like seeing things that I don't see every day. And
it's interesting you pay homage to St. Elsewhere in the pilot, though. You remember that?
I did, yeah. I mean, because, it was like, first of all, I have to tell you that when John and I decided to do it, everyone told us not to do it. Our lawyer, our agent. It was like
not to do what? Not to do St. Elsewhere or Northern Exposure?
Northern Exposure. They said it's a summer series. No one's going to watch it. They're not giving you enough money. That's why we made the population of the town 867 because they gave us $867,000 to make it. Well, now pilots will give you $10 million or $15 million. Or $20 million per episode of Severance or something I read somewhere. I mean, so it was, and so people said, don't do it. You're just wasting your time. But for me, my feeling has been and always has been, and still is, that if somebody's going to pay you money to do something you want to do, you're a fool not to do it. If it's something you want to do. It's kind of because, you don't know what the future is going to hold. And it was something I very much wanted to do. And I was influenced by two movies in particular. Movie Local Hero, made by a guy named Bill Forsyth, who was a Scottish director, and he made three beautiful movies, and a movie called Never Cry Wolf. Both were fish out of water stories. And Never Cry Wolf was about a guy who goes to, I don't know, northern Canada to study wolves. And
Was that a book? Was that a book first? Never.
yes, it was. It was a book.
Yeah.
And it was made by Carol Ballard, who was a cinematographer. So it's extraordinarily beautiful to look at. And there's one scene in that, I forgot the actor's name, but he falls asleep in the middle of nowhere and he hears a sound and he wakes up and it's like 10,000 reindeer run by him as he stands there naked in it. And there were two people who were Native Americans, and I just had never seen people like that anywhere ever depicted on screen in anything. And I thought they were like so real and so different.
And which project was this? Which project was this?
Well, it was in the movie Never Cry Wolf. And so when we were going to make Northern Exposure, and we wrote the pilot, and we went looking we knew we couldn't shoot it in Alaska because it didn't have the infrastructure, and we only had $800,000 to make it, and Universal was doing it as non-union. So you may not remember this, Rob, but the crew, they would say, well, who wants to be the key grip, And it would be like, oh, you're the key grip, Jim Hyman, who we hired, he had done one independent movie that I had seen that was based on, it was about an American teacher who was studying karate in Japan or something, or China. And so we were hiring people, and it was non-union, and Universal didn't even put its logo on there. We had to have this guy, Bob Scotus, and it says, Bob Scotus Productions or something like that. Then, of course, when the show became successful, then Universal said, wait a second, union, we'll put our name up on it. And, but for that first go-around, nobody thought anybody was going to see it. And it was...
Do you remember our reading when we all sat around a table and read the show in that little old, office? It'd been an office complex, and we sat around that table, and you and Josh were there, and all the cast, and we read through the pilot for the first time. And I remember that you looked over, and we talked about this last week, but you said, we're thinking about having a moose go through the opening credits. You could just take so many chances, I believe, because it was a summer series, right? And just to stick with your poetic literature aspect, I think that the intellectualism of the show and the way that you always, talked about Freud or Jung or Walt Whitman or whatever it might be, you could use Chris in the Morning or to do that. That was what really was unique about the show. And was it not because it was a summer series where you could take all those risks for 8 episodes? I believe that if you had told people what you were going to do in a regular season, the networks and studios would have said absolutely not. But because it was a summer series, you guys were like free for all. It's like, we can do whatever we want. And then the public loved it and responded to it. And that gave you the creative power then to continue with that kind of trajectory. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we were flying under the radar. And, it was difficult in a lot of ways because there wasn't money. But the same token, I mean, the natural beauty that, now we see shows done all over the world, and, it's not unusual. But at that time, you were watching, there were 3 networks, and you were watching shows that were shot in Los Angeles. I mean, and, in rooms where Universal was known, they would just change the background and that you would be in a different room. I mean, nobody cared about the visual aspects of the show, but we were in this natural beauty, and it was like wherever you put the camera, it was just the audience and me, the director and the writers and the actors. It was like, look what we're seeing. And so, yeah, we were flying under the radar. They were just writing off of a commitment. I mean, the studio.
But it's funny. it's funny, as you were talking about how, I remember the SCOTUS of it all. I'll leave it at that. But when the show started to show promise, we were shooting in warehouses, not proper sound stages, and they sent up all these engineers to shore up the ceiling because they thought our things were going to fall on our heads. And I just remember thinking, well, where were they last year? We were working all under this last year. But I just want to ask you one thing about, I'm so touched by what you said about, it's such a great quality as a writer, obviously, but that you're so interested in other people. That's what, other people's stories. And that's how you kind of created this. I always have found it fascinating that I believe you and John had never been to Alaska before you wrote the show, but more specifically, the capturing of Native American sensibilities is so specific and beautifully rendered. And I don't remember, there was no one on the staff that was Native American, but how did you go about that? And how do you inhabit those, like Anku in the, Ed's uncle, like he's so the cadences and the philosophies and all that. Where did you get all that?
And I just want to interject, Josh, real quick. That was before the internet, right? So it's not like you could just look something up on the internet. But Rob is right. The whole Native American element, especially that was really prevalent in the second episode, was just beautiful. So where was that genesis?
Well, we did have a Native American advisor. Now, I've told this story and I will run into trouble, or people always, because, back in the 70s, it was very common that, did black people want to be called black? Did they want to be called African American? Was it okay to call them Negro? The same thing was with Native Americans. And I would go to and his name was Jerry, and he was a guy who was sort of a respected guy in the Native American community. Although, and I asked him, I said, I have a couple of stupid questions to ask you. And I said, one is, why do you all have long hair? And he said, well, we believe that when you go on to the next world, the next life, you have to bring your hair with you. Okay, makes sense. I said, why do you all have such great teeth? He said,
what are you going to do? Got to get a wig.
I don't have to bring it to the next world. That's
okay.
But and I said, well, how come you all have such great teeth? And he said, bridge work. They were fake, And actually, if you see Never Cry Wolf, it's called Never Cry Wolf because it's about these two Native Americans, and they kill these wolves, and they use the money from the dead wolves to get bridge work. And then I said, well, what do I call you? Now, I was directing the first episode, and of course, Universal didn't want me to direct it. And I guess it was because they thought I was going to have too much control or something. I don't know what they thought.
That was one of my questions.
But I said, I'm directing it or I'm not doing it. And they said, well, we're not going to pay you for, and I said, pay me whatever you're going to pay me. Whatever the minimum was, pay me. But I'm directing it or I'm not doing it. And they said, so they had to let me do it.
And is that because you just felt that you clearly knew what the show needed to be, and you didn't want to have an intermediary?
Well, I think it was a couple of things. First of all, it was very proprietary to me, the show. I just felt that it was very personal. It was the most personal thing I had done. As I said, I'm not a guy who writes autobiographically. I don't write about being a Jewish kid whose parents were immigrants growing up in Queens. But by the same token, whatever I write about comes out of me, right? So it's, right. I don't, I could write science fiction, and I don't know what it's like to live on another planet and to be an alien, and nobody does, but people write it. And so they.
Yeah, it's funny you say that though, because when you describe the person you don't write about that's exactly what Joel Fleischman is.
Well, but it is. Well, Joel Fleischman is in certain ways like me, but he's not. I'm not. Right. I'm not an upper middle class Jewish kid. My father was a tile setter. He was an immigrant. I didn't come from that world of the Upper East Side, and I didn't come from that. But he was like me he was Jewish and he was from New York. And that's the fish out of water. And you put him in Alaska, He
was from Queens.
He was from Queens, and Queens is an interesting place or uninteresting place. You can listen to Malcolm Gladwell does a podcast with Paul Simon, and Paul Simon's from Queens as well. And it's interesting what it means to be from Queens in New York. But in any case, that's not really the point. But so I asked Jerry, and I said, well, what do I call you? And he said, let me tell you a story. And I'll try to make this very brief. But he said he went to a Native American convocation or whatever it was called. There were hundreds or thousands of different tribes. And they said, what are we going to be called? This was, in the 90s. And people said, oh, we should be called Native Americans. We should be called this. And he said, one guy got up, an elder, very respected guy. And he said, 18 million of us have been killed because we were Indians. We have earned the right to be called Indians. And I said, whoa, that's heavy. And I said, so can I call you Indians? He said, absolutely. And I said,
Josh, that brings up, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that brings up a really interesting point. You were really willing in this episode to not be politically correct, in the series to not be politically correct, right?
But I asked him, and I was directing the pilot, and there would be a point where I needed a couple of extras. And I said, I need a couple of Indians down here. And all the white people went, whoa, there he goes with Indians again. And now I know people would say, well, now it's not okay too. But I've thought about it as a Jewish person, because, when I die, I want to be cremated. And Jews aren't supposed to be cremated, they're supposed to be buried. And I spoke to a rabbi and I said, listen, 6 million Jews were cremated because they were Jews. Haven't Jews earned the right to be cremated? And he said, I know how you feel emotionally. It makes sense, but I can't go that far. So my point is, the words change. The nomenclature changes over time. And of course, I'll call anybody what they want to be called. I mean, if you tell me you want to be called something, I'll call you that. What do I care? I mean, it's not sweat off my back. But it was really, it was a very powerful thing to say 18 million people were killed because they were Indians. They were called Indians.
But Josh, I want to...
Not as an insult. They used it as, now, of course, time has changed. This was 35 years ago. And so now it's different. But at that moment in time, it was, and I've said it at the time, people, I know when I say it, they get, they bridle. It's kind of like saying, I don't know, other words that are not necessarily intended to be, insulting. I mean, I didn't do it because
Josh, you said something to me along the, I don't know when it was, first season perhaps. If you were to read the dialogue that we write for Maggie O'Connell, right? People would just say, I can't believe you're writing that. I can't believe she would say that. I can't believe she would do that. But it was the way that as the inherent aspects of your writing and the arc of the episode, A, but B, that what we brought to it as actors, that we brought this kind of level of humanity to it, that was accepted. It was accepted. I mean, the crazy things that Rob comes out of Rob's, Fleischman's mouth and comes out of my mouth and comes out of Barry's mouth, right? And all the things that Barry says that we do, you go, oh my God, listen to what he just said. And he just said this, this, and this. But at the end, there's an arc where you just go, and I think it's a lesson for today's society, where you just go further, you just go deeper into the aspects of their humanity, right? That they aren't bad people. They're just struggling with their own sort of life lessons. And at the end of the episode, they had this kind of forgiveness and mercy and grace and life lesson that redeemed the character. And so it wasn't so much about a word he said or a description he said. You found out what was going on behind it. And I think that's what made me cry in the second episode. When Barry Corbin says, I would stand up for Walt Whitman any day of the week, no matter what kind of person he was. If someone says negative things about Walt Whitman, I'm there to protect Walt Whitman. It doesn't matter what his sexual preferences were. I'm there to defend him. And I just started to cry, that's the sense of humanity, where we're fallible and we make mistakes. And I think you're touching on something. There were like words thrown out that today people would go, oh my gosh, I can't believe you would say that. But the way y'all took it with the arc of humanity, can you talk about that a little bit? There's the juxtaposition of the characters. And I just want to say this one last thing. Maggie O'Connell was from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, where she was really rich, but now she's in, Alaska, and she's fixes her own plane, fixes her own plane and her plumbing, and kills her own deer and chops her own wood. And Barry Corbin was this astronaut. Maurice was this astronaut, but he was a deeply, deeply sensitive person that ironed his girlfriend's underwear. You know what I mean? And then you had Ed, who like loved, who was just so Native American in his spirit, but he loved Woody Allen movies. And I think it was this kind of juxtaposition of the struggle within our own humanity that you touched on that makes the show so evergreen in a way. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think a few things. I think saints make bad role models because they're perfect. And so nobody can be perfect. They're not a good role model to have a saint. If you were a saint, wonderful, to make a statue for you, you're Catholic, and that's great. But they're bad role models because human beings are flawed. We're all flawed, every single one of us. To think you're not flawed is to not know yourself or not understand yourself. So, since we're all flawed, and we're not saints, no one is a saint except saints, and they're bad role models because they're not like us, the rest of us. They're just different than us, but all of us are flawed. So once you accept that we're all flawed, then the only thing that sort of, and people, Northern Exposure, it's not really a feel-good show. There's a lot of death in Northern Exposure. Animals, people, death is a part of life. And it's not, there's a gravitas to that. And people understand it in the show. Howling, people hunt, they do all of that stuff. I think that when you understand that all human beings are flawed, there's a difference between liking characters and characters being nice. Tony Soprano's not a nice guy, but you like him. So you can like characters who are not nice. When they're nice, you don't necessarily like them because they're just nice. Maybe.
And why do you like them? Like someone like Tony Soprano, or what is it that allows us to like them, even though they're killing people or whatever?
That's a more interesting question. I mean, I think, it's not just Tony Soprano. I mean, all of anti-heroes and there's a whole movies for 30 years were all anti-heroes. You couldn't do heroes. Everybody was an anti-hero. Dog Day Afternoon, or all the Dustin Hoffman movies. I mean, I think what there is part of it is the actor. Just like there are certain actors who are inherently funny. And then there are actors who are smart and can figure out where the funny is. I worked with Billy Crystal, who's really funny. And I would say, Billy, not everything has to basically, you don't have to fall off your chair laughing. He goes, oh, you mean the other funny? So when you're saying what makes us like them, I mean, there's certain actors you like. When you see them, and then there's certain actors you don't really like, and they play great bad guys. I don't know.
So it's why casting is so important. But there's something more. I think what you were alluding to. There's something more too. Yeah,
there is something to it. But what I'm really saying is part of it is that it's what I can say is that we're all flawed. So essentially, the most interesting characters are flawed, and the most interesting characters say the wrong things at times. I mean, nobody ever says the right thing all the time unless they're a Stepford wife. I mean, who goes through life always saying the right things? And if they are just saying the right things all the time, you think they're programmed. Right. It doesn't feel human. And so I think it's a different, it's not a way that sort of, certainly back in the day, network television, they had all these rules about, you couldn't even have, for you guys, you couldn't have two dark-haired people, a man and a woman, star in the show together. I mean, they had rules, really. You're going to be too ethnic.
Right.
It's like, no, of course. So that went out of the way. And then there's different things that come in and replace it, but they're all kind of nonsensical. And for me, the key to Northern Exposure is everything is forgivable except for malice. What is malice? It's intent to hurt, intent to harm. We hurt people, we get hurt, we harm people, we are harmed. but it's not intent. The only thing that would be unforgivable to the people in that town is not that you hurt people, not that you killed somebody, not that anything, manslaughter, but if you intended to do it. Right. And that's something that I think, David Chase never understood about the show.
I
never
agree.
had a conversation with him.
I agree.
He never understood.
I agree completely with that.
Universe. Well, it doesn't mean that you don't have different opinions about people. It means that if you say you're in love with you as Maggie did that great story, with the dog, where she falls in love and she's in love with the dog, and we saw them, love is love. I have a dog. You can love animals the same way you love people. I mean, it's not that you can love them as much as you can have a horse. I know people who love their horse. I know people who love people of a different sex, the same sex. Love is love. It's a feeling that you can have for things. So some people don't understand that.
Right. Can I ask you something? I'm curious about how the responsibilities were split up, like between you and John. And I always sensed that somehow, percentage-wise, more of the show was on your shoulders. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm also interested in Stuart Stevens is credited with this episode, but my guess is on episode 2, you guys your hands were all over every word of it. So how did you and John break it up?
Well, we most of the time that I spent on the show, again, John and I both did. We were the only writers on when we worked together on The White Shadow, and then on St. Elsewhere, we did all the stories and took all the story credit because I felt something was being taken away from me. I was very young. I was 32. And but I didn't do it on Northern Exposure. I spent most of my time on story, rewriting, and editing. And I spent a lot of my time on music because I loved it. But the other things is real, and I didn't take credit on anything unless I wrote it. John and I, first of all, the idea of the moose was John's idea, and thank God, because we couldn't you can't train a moose. And we couldn't get a moose. And I was ready to give up on a moose. And, and he said, no, we got to get a moose. We got to get a moose. We got to get a moose. And we got a moose. And I shot that moose. I directed that. And we only had him for like 4 hours. And it made it look like he was walking through town.
I've never seen a better performance from a moose, just to want to tell you.
There were 2 mooses on that moose. The truth is, like when I left the show, and people say, oh, you left the show, Rob Morrow, he had some, thing with, I don't know, his contract. I had nothing to do with that. I left the show because I had done 66 episodes and I was kind of burnt out. I felt I was repeating myself. And John...
That's why I left, by the way.
Well,
it's funny, all the contractual stuff gets conflated into so many different stories. If I had a year
off to, rejuice my batteries, I wouldn't have left. I just felt I'm just doing this. I have to pull away. And John, we were partners, but truthfully, what John loved is he loved I'll Fly Away, and he loved A Year in the Life. He loved writing about a family.
Right.
And I, by then, was bored with that. I didn't want to do that. And so, for the most part...
what was it? So, Josh, what was a day in the life like? Because we were in Seattle, filming every day. And just so the listeners understand, y'all were in Los Angeles, and we never knew even what was happening. So when you walked into the kind of, I guess, office that y'all had, and to Rob's question, Stuart wrote the script, but how much did you tweak that script? And how did you know Stuart? Because Stuart wrote the second. I think these things are interesting for the listeners. How did you know Stuart? How did you know the director? And then what did you change in it?
Well, a lot of it is rewritten, but essentially that's what your job is as a showrunner. So I was talking with, someone last night, a writer, and he said when he worked on a show and he did an episode and he gave it to the showrunner and said, boy, thank you, you made it so much better. And the showrunner said, well, that's what we do. That's the job, is to rewrite it. Stuart Stevens is he's a famous guy, but not because of television. He ran Mitt Romney's campaign. He ran George Bush's. He was a Republican operative. He
Much
also is a
later.
guy
That
who
was
was a
much
novel.
later. That was much later. I mean, but in 1990, how did you meet
Well, I
him
met
to
him
write
through a
the script?
mutual friend who worked at CBS, and he was a very interesting guy. He was a novelist, and one of his books I had him adapt as a screenplay, and he'd gone to AFI, and and I liked him, and I thought he was really smart. He had been a Marlboro man on the commercials on big billboards, very handsome guy, and he also.
Wait, oh, I didn't know that. Wait, he was a model in those
Well,
ads?
he also, National Geographic did a documentary about him. He set the world record for skiing, downhill skiing on those seven largest
Oh,
mountains in the world. He was an
what an
amazing
interesting guy.
guy. Oh, he's a fascinating guy. And we
So
Yeah.
became
you
good
hired
friends.
him? Did you hire him and you knew him before and said, "Do you want to come in and write episode 2?"
Yeah, because essentially, my job was I knew what the story was. It was brains, know-how, and native intelligence. It was sort of perfect for the second episode of the show because it's a New Yorker. I'm from New York. What does it mean to be a New Yorker as a generalization? New Yorkers think that they're the most sophisticated people on the planet. They know the best restaurant and they know the best place to shop for clothes, but they're the most provincial people. Nobody knows how to do anything in the city because you have supers, you don't know if your electricity goes off. So the notion of intelligence is graduate degrees. Why I love the Chris character, because an intellectual is not an academic. An intellectual is a person to whom ideas are real.
Interesting.
You could have had a high school education or not even have gone to high school and be an intellectual, not an academic. Academic, you have to have a PhD. That's different than an intellectual. So Chris was an intellectual. So the idea is if you live in New York, what people care about is what firm you work for, what law firm, where you went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And, that's true for also the East Coast. And it's also true for the West Coast as well. But Stuart wrote novels. He wrote about 8 novels. And, I read a couple of his novels. He was from Mississippi, grew up in a small town. He was a fascinating guy. He was an editor for Outside Magazine. He once... I could never understand the conversations he had with Mitt Romney because here he was, he wrote for Outside Magazine for 30 days. He took every drug you could possibly take for performance enhancement, and he did that. He would ride 100 miles a day on his bicycle and he was just a fascinating guy. So I said, well, I'm going to do this episode about 3 different kinds of intelligence,
Do you
brain.
give him a beat sheet or an outline, or you just say, here's the broad strokes?
Well, I don't really remember. I remember back in the day when I worked, and it wasn't just me. It was, my friends, Marcela Herskovitz, who did 30-something. We didn't have writers' rooms. We had writers. I worked on The White Shadow. There was no writer's room. I mean, nobody had writer's rooms. Now they did it in comedies. John and I wrote a 3-camera comedy, and it was a sitcom. And there we had the comic writers sitting around the table. It was the weirdest experience I ever had in my life. But we didn't have rooms. We had writers. And I would say, I want to do an episode about this. You've worked, you guys like each other. You come back to me and let me know this is what I want to have in it, and this is what I want to have in it. Make sure the audience isn't ahead of the story and it isn't schmaltzy, and make it real,
And then you rewrite it.
Yeah, and I'd rewrite it.
If I can interject for 2 seconds. So you went to Stuart, because this is really fascinating for me, actually. I'm sure the listeners are interested as well. You went to Stuart and said, this is the outline of the kind of show I want for episode 2. 3 kinds of intelligence. Go write it. Is that what happened? And then he brought it to you,
but I
and
think
then
it's
talk to us
more
about
than
the
that.
tweaks. Talk to us about the tweaks that you did after that. Because what I always heard behind the scenes, and this is a compliment to you, Josh, is that you were in every room. right? You were in the music room, you were in the editing room, you were in the looping room, you were in the writing room, and that you were the one that oversaw the general, and I'm sure John was there too, but the actual, overarching aspect of pulling this show together. So I'm really curious if you said go write a show about 3 kinds of native intelligence, and he brought it to you, and then what happened then? What did you do with the
Well,
script?
again, it's hard for me to remember that specific episode, but in
Or
general,
in
it would be
general,
more than that. Well,
yeah.
because Stuart really, he hadn't worked in television, so I knew that. But I knew he had gone to AFI, so he did screenplays. I had hired him to do a screenplay from his book. I knew he knew how to write. And essentially what I did is, because it was the second episode, I was directing the pilot, so it had to be written while I'm working, or before then, or with John or whatever. But it wasn't like saying, go write it here, it's about these 3 things. It was much more specific than that. But it wasn't specific in like a formulaic. It was saying, I want to have this in it. I remember John saying, Dan Rather, I want to have Dan Rather, have him in this little town, be watching Dan Rather on the news. It was like, right. You would get all of the things that you wanted to see in it. Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman. I mean, I knew about that. I knew the character of Chris by then. I knew that I knew that John Corbett was from West Virginia, and that's why we made him from West Virginia. And I knew that he had been in prison, and he talks about and I knew that he was an intellectual.
Wait, not Corbett.
John Corbett, I'm sorry.
No, not Corbett wasn't in prison.
Not the character was in prison.
I mean the character.
We want to clarify that. Yeah.
And by the way, he's Chris Stevens, so it was Stuart Stevens. I mean, he gave him the last name.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's funny.
Interesting. See, that's really cool.
And so it was much more involved, but it wasn't involved in a formulaic way. And then, of course, when he writes it, then you take it over, and then and I don't honestly, at this point, I don't remember how much or how little work was done on it. I just know that, there were a lot of things that we did in the beginning of the show that, there were. I know when I would work with you guys as actors and we'd be looping. A lot of times we were looping a lot, and I was because we were a dialogue-oriented show. We didn't really kill people. We didn't. And so to keep things moving along, I would basically sort of loop a lot of extra stuff, and then over time became to sort of trust that the audience was going to allow there to be gaps and let it be more filmic. But in the beginning, it was kind of like, because we weren't telling jokes, it wasn't the Billy Crystal where you're going to fall out of your chair laughing. There's a lot of humor, it's clearly, and then we won the award for being, Emmys for being a drama, but it really was a comedy. What does that mean? There's only dramas and comedy. I mean,
well,
we know a lot about drama.
If I can give a little behind the scenes, I know that y'all wanted the show to be on Monday night after Murphy Brown. That it was really important that the show was after Murphy Brown. Correct me if I'm wrong, and so I remember John Falsey calling me, and because I was always this sort of actress that wanted to bring 13,000 million, layers of emotions behind what I was doing. You know what I mean? And John Falsey called me and he said, "We're a comedy. Write it down." He wanted me to remember because we were trying to get into that after Murphy Brown time slot. Do you remember that?
That's more John than me. I mean, John was, and he went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he was a serious writer, but he loved television, and I didn't really know that much about television. I watched television, but I wasn't a TV watcher, and he was more of a TV watcher, and he knew more about where the show should go. I didn't really care about any of that, quite honestly.
Let me just, I know we're coming up on the hour, which I feel like we could talk to you for 5 hours, but I just want to speak a little bit, or have you speak a little bit about, before in the preamble, before the show started, we were talking about you were in a film festival in Majorca, and you were amazed how the audience, how A, that there was such a large audience, but B, that it was filled with young people. I'd love for you to speak a little bit about why you think the show is still, because it's extraordinary to me that, because I get a lot of social media people from, with their kids, they're watching it, they're 10-year-olds, they're 15-year-olds. And why do you think the show is still relevant and still captures and is having this kind of, it's a bit of a phenomenon. I mean, I think it's one of the top rated streamers on Amazon, right? And it's 30 plus years old. Like, what is that?
Well, I think Janine hit on it. I think that just like language changes, cool became hip, became rad, whatever it is, language changes. We don't have cell phones. Technology changes. We didn't have cell phones back then, but then there aren't cell phones, and so then everybody has cell phones. So you could say those things are dated, but at the core, what makes things timeless, it's why people still go to see Shakespeare plays. It's why people still go to see, Buster Keaton comedies. I mean, it's that at the core, what it means to be human and to be alive and to be flawed and to be conflicted and to have opposing thoughts at the same time in one person. You like this, but you like this. You're torn between this, you're torn between that. Things are not black and white. 90% of things are gray. And then there's some things that are black and some things that are white. And I think the core of the show was not about technology. And the core of the show was not about, are you saying, oh, you're cool, or oh, you're far out. And we avoided those things. And by the way, it's what we avoided in music as well. I mean, it's why for years they would say, oh, the show couldn't stream because of the music. That's nonsense. I mean, I would go to Hawaii and I would hire a guy playing the ukulele. I would see those, people playing the flutes on the subways, or drummers, and we hired them for a dream sequence. We didn't use hit tunes from the moment. Yes, we used, songs that had been famous from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s even, but we weren't trying to be topical. And so if you avoid topicality, yeah, those things change over time, but what remains is death, pain, love, anger, conflict. And those are things that I think that when you watch the show, yes, people can say, oh, it didn't make any sense why the character, didn't call up on the telephone or something. I don't know. But I never really was concerned about that. I didn't really, and I think.
But you're amazed that you seem amazed too that it is still a phenomenon.
Well, I'm not really amazed because I think, Josh, what you're talking about, you deal with the complexity of life. And now that I'm 62, right? And I've had a daughter that I've had to raise, nothing will make you feel more, off your rocker, or you failed than a child. You know what I mean? And so it's like the complexity of humanity and the core of, I keep saying it, but just the way that, and I would love to kind of end talking a little bit about the complexity of the characters, because, and also there was always movement in the scenes. There was always the nature or action or movement. It moved, but just the complexity and the emotional quality of what people were dealing with their own faults, but inherently they were trying to be good. And ultimately they came back around it. But just the complexity of human beings. And I will juxtaposition that with today's society, because today's society is like, you have to be perfect. And you can't possibly say anything that's wrong. And you have to be perfect. Or if someone's not perfect in your life, you need to leave them. Right? It's just this kind of like craziness. But here is a kind of, as Rob talks about, and you talk about, the benevolent universe, this kind of, it's not even a utopia because it's realism. We're fallible. So can you talk about that complexity of the characters? Because that's one of the things I love so much. I get so many scripts where it's just, this is the character and she's one note, right? And every time we got a script from you, Josh, right, it was always a short story. It was always a joy. It was so exciting to see what sort of adventure we would be on, whether I was suddenly in an igloo or speaking Russian or whatever I was doing, the kind of fantasy world that you took it in. But there was still always that root of human complexity, kind of like a Dostoevsky novel. And I think that's why to go to Rob's point, why it's still so people gravitate to it today, because you go, I realize that I might not be perfect, but I'm trying to be good. You know what I mean? So talk about that complexity, that juxtaposition of all the characters of Maurice and Darren and Josh and Ed and Ed and Barry Maurice, all the different characters and their kind of complexities.
Well, I mean, a lot of that, I don't know. I mean, that's another big question. I don't know that I can answer it, in a nutshell. But I do think that, listen, a lot of that is what the actors bring to it. I mean, it's let actors act. I mean, you don't have to write the subtext. I mean, let them act. And you guys did that very well. And everybody, for the most part, did that really well. And so we trusted that. And the other thing is, I think from a writer's point of view, it's you don't want the audience to be ahead of the story. So you don't want to basically, because it's boring if you're ahead of the story. If you're watching something, you know what's going to happen. You go, I know this is going to happen, that's going to happen. So it's important to let the audience think sometimes they're ahead of the story, but then not to let them be ahead of the story, because then the audience gets pleasure out of it. So, it's related to characters being complex. It means that, one of the things I learned about, when I directed the pilot and when I directed is I always felt, and I still feel this, that the camera can tell when an actor is thinking. The camera can't tell what the actor is thinking. Like you could say to the actor, think about where you're going to eat lunch today. The camera can see if you're thinking, but it can't see what you're thinking about. And so if you think
that's what David Lean said. That's what makes a movie star is an actor who it's not, as you say, not read specific thoughts, but read thoughts.
Well, yeah. So essentially what you want to do is when you see somebody blank and you go, you got to think about something. Think about who you think is going to win the World Series. I don't care what you think about, because the camera can't discern what you're thinking about. It can just see if you're thinking. And by the way, babies are the same way. I have a grandson. He's like 4 months old. I see that baby looking at my dog and he's thinking something. I have no idea what he's thinking. But when that baby is tired and he's looking at you with glassy eyes, he's not thinking about anything. And I can tell he just wants to go to sleep. So the point is, you want good actors. I mean, and we were very fortunate. And listen, I mean, one of the things we did, I mean, it was like, and we had a 60-year-old guy with an 18-year-old girl. I mean, how un-PC was that?
Yeah, good luck doing that now.
You knew that he loved her. You knew. John Cullum was a great actor, great stage. You knew that he loved her. And you could not like it or be mad at it or he shouldn't like that or it's wrong. But the bottom line is you knew that he loved her. Yeah. And so I'm a man with his head on the bar, Shelley, I mean, John Falsey's line, it's like he was. And so the audience will forgive you. The audience will give you latitude. And I think, I think that all of those things are related to why it's successful. And yes, first of all, I'm gratified more than amazed. But I will say the thing that is surprising to me, and it was the interviewer who was interviewing in Spanish, somebody whispering in my ear, translating Catalan, into English. But the bottom line, she said, a whole new generation is discovering. And then I had dinner with my friend Stu and, a couple of writers. And Stu said, I'm watching it with my 8-year-old son, and it's like, and it isn't just people revisiting it for nostalgia purposes. And I think it's because, because they don't, in American television, we don't really do things like that. I mean, it's a European tradition. I mentioned those two movies. I mean, Calvin Ballard, I think he's Canadian, but maybe not. But Bill Forsyth, those character-driven, idiosyncratic movies. We don't do them. And when we do them, we take those movies and we turn them into something that's really instead of three-dimensional, two-dimensional. And it's a broad comedy. The laughs got to be big laughs, and because we were flying under the radar, and because again, here's the thing. My parents were immigrants. My parents didn't speak English well. How do you learn when your parents are immigrants? Now, my parents came from Eastern Europe, and now immigrants come from all over, West Africa, East Africa. You learn by observing. You're an outsider. You watch people. Nobody taught me about table manners. Nobody taught me about the right way to, and all immigrants are like that. And so I was a first generation. And so I learned by observing. And I think that that's sort of what the success is, that we weren't trying to mimic an experience that people have in America. We were mimicking an experience about something that was universal.
Well, I'll just say one of the things I love about the show, which is missing in today's work, is to allow the camera to just resonate on a face, right? Or a three shot or whatever it may be. Let's let humanity play out here, and the kind of saturation of the thinking, of the words, of the beautiful environment. Today, everything's edited really fast. It's like 2 seconds. Or, scenes are maybe literally like 30 seconds and they're out. And I think that's part of the success of the show. Is it's still a show where you are able to kind of go into that environment and sort of feel like you were imbuing yourself into that utopia, that environment where I think that's one of the, in closing here, and Rob and Josh, you can talk on this, people wanted to live in Sicily.
Yeah. That's a good, I think that's a good ending point. People want to live in Sicily. I think they still do.
Yeah.
So Josh, thank you so much, man. It's absolute pleasure to hear you talk about the show and see you looking so well and healthy and with your grandkids. And, I always get emotional when I think about those times like Janine, because you gave us this life, you gave both of us a life that I don't know how we would have had you not said, yeah, you're the guy. And that said, then the experience, the adventure of making Northern Exposure is always going to be a highlight in my life, not just the success of it, but the adventure of it. And what I learned, not just as a man, in terms of the world, but in terms of what I learned about art and literature and philosophy and spirituality and culture, it opened my eyes. And so I'm grateful to you, and I'll let Janine sign off.
And vice versa. I'm grateful to you guys. Listen, it takes a village.
I'll always love you in my heart because you believed in me, and to play Maggie O'Connell, this fierce, tough, sensitive woman whose all of her boyfriends died. Yeah, you know what I mean. And then how Rob comes and dances with me anyway, and believe it was just this level of acceptance. But the fact that you believed in me, and Josh, and John in heaven, just your creativity and your genius, and the entire team. I mean, this show was just, how many shows sit back and quote Walt Whitman or Jung or Freud or whatever, or have all these intricacies of different levels of humanity. So you're a genius, Josh. And I thank you for the show that you created. And I hope you'll come back to our show, because I know everyone's hanging on every word that you have to say.
Well, thanks for having me. And it's great seeing both of you. You look great. And listen, back at you. I mean, you guys were great. I mean, it was, like I said, it was proprietary for me. It was a thing that I was most connected to. And it was heartbreaking for me to leave. But I needed a break. And really when I did, the thing is, John, I was willing to do another 13. I said, John, if you'll do 9. And he didn't really feel that he could do it. That was not his thing. That being said, it was our thing, and we both did it, but he was drawn in other directions, and I'm so gratified that I had the opportunity to do it. So, thanks.
Okay.
Thank
well,
you.
thanks for watching, everyone out there.
Beautiful. Yes, thank you. Next week, John Corbett is our guest, and we're going to talk about the character that he created, that was created. I'll just harken back to Josh about everything. Josh was the God that birthed like the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but Josh did such a beautiful job with the character. John Corbett. So we have John Corbett next week, and Josh, I hope you'll come back. And it's just great to see you. I'm so glad we have this excuse to say hi.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled. It's great seeing both your faces too. You still look fantastic. I don't know.
Well, so do you, Josh. So do you.
But okay. Well, anyway.
All right.
Thanks.
Northern Disclosure is a production with Evergreen Podcasts and executive produced by Paul Anderson and Scott McCarthy for Workhouse Media.